Hello everyone, I am the boring historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now, get comfortable and relax. The great house of Thornfield Manor stood sentinel over the rolling countryside of northern England. Its brick and stone facade weathered by decades of harsh winters and brief, brilliant summers. Built in 1842 by the industrialist Edward Thornfield, the house represented the pinnacle of Victorian architectural ambition, a statement of wealth and social position wrought in stone. Its 47 rooms spread across 4 floors, from the damp cellars that housed the coal and wine to the cramped attic chambers where the lowest servants slept. In the autumn of 1878, the house was home to the Thornfield family. William, the master of the house and Edward's son, his wife Eleanor, their 3 children, James 16, Margaret 14, and little George 7. Eleanor's aging mother, Mrs. Beatrice Whiteley, and 14 servants who maintained the household's demanding rhythms. Thornfield Manor also frequently welcomed guests, as befitted a family of their standing. On this particular day in October 1878, the house would play host to Dr. Henry Lancaster, a respected physician from London and an old-school friend of William's, and his wife, Mrs. Amelia Lancaster. This narrative chronicles a single day at Thornfield Manor, from the pre-dawn stirrings of the lowest servants to the midnight quiet when even the wealthiest inhabitants finally succumb to sleep. Within these 24 hours unfolds a microcosm of Victorian life. Its rigid hierarchies, its technological advances and medical superstitions, its moral certainties and hidden hypocrisies, and the vastly different experiences of those who shared the same roof but lived in entirely different worlds. The grandfather clock in the main hallway struck 4, its deep chimes reverberating through the sleeping house. In the cavernous kitchen, situated in the basement, no one was present to hear it. But in the cramped attic rooms above the main house, the kitchen maid Alice Marsh was already stirring. At 17, Alice had been at Thornfield Manor for 3 years, having started as a scullery maid at 14. Her narrow iron bedstead was pushed against the wall of a room she shared with 2 other lower servants, Betsy, another kitchen maid, and Jenny, the scullery maid. The room was barely 8 feet square, unheated, with a single small window that let in both light and, through poorly sealed edges, the bitter autumn wind. Alice dressed quietly in the dark, not wanting to wake the others who wouldn't need to rise for another hour. Her uniform was simple, a coarse cotton shift beneath a plain black dress, covered by a large white apron. Her red, chapped hands spoke of constant immersion in hot water and harsh soap. She pulled her hair back severely and covered it with a plain white cap. The narrow servants' staircase creaked as Alice descended 4 flights to the basement. The steps were worn in the middle from decades of servants' feet. Oil lamps fixed to the walls at intervals provided meager light, as the sun wouldn't rise for hours yet. The air grew noticeably cooler as she descended to the basement level. The kitchen was dark and cold, the massive cast-iron range, the heart of the household, sitting dormant like a slumbering beast. Alice's first task was always the same, to bring this iron monster to life. She opened the firebox and cleared out yesterday's ashes, carrying them to the ash bucket in the scullery. Returning with kindling and coal from the adjacent coal cellar, she carefully built a fire that would heat not only the ovens and hot plates for cooking, but also provide hot water for the entire household through an ingenious system of pipes. By the faint glow of the newly kindled fire, Alice moved with the efficiency of long practice. The kitchen was vast, 20 feet long and 15 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough to capture the worst of the heat that would build up later in the day. A massive wooden table dominated the center, scarred by thousands of knife cuts from food preparation. Copper pots hung from racks above, gleaming dully in the firelight. The walls were lined with dressers holding the enormous collection of plates, serving dishes and specialized cooking implements needed to prepare meals for the family and their guests. As the fire began to catch properly, Alice pumped water from the kitchen pump into the massive copper kettle and set it on the hob to boil. The kitchen gradually brightened as she lit oil lamps and positioned them strategically around the workspace. The house still slept above her, but soon it would awaken, hungry and demanding. At 4:30, the kitchen door opened, and Mr. Phelps, the house steward, entered. Unlike most of the household, who would appear progressively more formal as they dressed for the day, Mr. Phelps was already immaculately attired in his black suit, starched white shirt, and perfectly tied cravat. At 55, he had spent most of his life in service, the last 20 years at Thornfield Manor. He was the highest-ranking male servant, answering only to Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, and ultimately to the master and mistress themselves. "Good morning, Alice," he said, his voice low but carrying the natural authority of his position. "Is the range heating properly? Mrs. Simmons will need it at full temperature when she arrives at 5. "Yes, Mr. Phelps," Alice replied, keeping her eyes slightly downcast as was expected. "The fire's catching well, and I've just put the kettle on." "Very good. I'll be in my office. Send the scullery maid to me when she comes down. The silver needs attention today with the Lancasters arriving." Mr. Phelps's office was a small room adjacent to the kitchen, from which he oversaw the male staff and managed the household accounts. The female staff, meanwhile, answered to Mrs. Wilson, whose domain was on the ground floor near the family areas. As Mr. Phelps departed, Alice continued her preparations. She retrieved eggs, butter, and milk from the cool pantry. The bread dough, which had been set to rise overnight, needed to be kneaded and shaped for baking. The servants' breakfast would need to be ready by 6, followed immediately by preparations for the family's breakfast at 8. By 5 o'clock, the kitchen had transformed. The fire roared in the range, heating the room to a comfortable temperature that would become stifling by midday. Mrs. Simmons, the cook, arrived precisely at 5, her bulk filling the doorway momentarily before she moved with surprising grace to her domain. At 48, she had been cook at Thornfield for 12 years and ruled the kitchen with absolute authority. "Good morning, Mrs. Simmons," Alice said, stepping back from the table where she had been working the bread dough. "Morning, girl," Mrs. Simmons replied, her eyes sweeping the kitchen critically. "Water boiling? We'll need tea straight away. Mr. Phelps will want his cup exactly at 1:30. "The kettle's just coming to the boil now, ma'am." "Good. Where's that useless scullery maid? The vegetables need scrubbing, and we've got that dinner party tonight." "Jenny should be down any minute, ma'am." As if summoned by her name, the door opened again and Jenny hurried in, her cap askew and her apron hastily tied. At 14, she was the newest and lowest servant in the household, having arrived from the local orphanage just 4 months earlier. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Simmons," she said breathlessly. "I didn't hear the house clock." "That's no excuse for tardiness," Mrs. Simmons said sharply. "Mr. Phelps wants to see you about the silver, but first get those vegetables scrubbed. We've 20 pounds of potatoes to prepare today, not to mention the carrots and turnips." The scullery adjoined the kitchen, a small, perpetually damp room with a deep stone sink and pumps for both hot and cold water. Jenny would spend most of her day there, up to her elbows in water, washing not only vegetables but also the endless stream of pots, pans, and dishes that a household like Thornfield generated. By 5:30, more servants had appeared. Betsy, the second kitchen maid, joined Alice in preparing the servants' breakfast. Thomas, the 17-year-old hall boy, staggered in with a huge scuttle of coal for the range, his face already streaked with coal dust despite the early hour. His main task was keeping the fires throughout the house supplied with fuel, a never-ending job in the colder months that required him to carry tons of coal up and down stairs each week. At 5:45, Mrs. Wilson made her first appearance of the day. As housekeeper, she was the highest-ranking female servant and second only to Mr. Phelps in the household hierarchy. In her 50s, she wore a plain black dress with a bunch of keys at her waist, the symbol of her authority. These keys opened every cupboard, drawer, and pantry in the house where valuable supplies were kept. "Good morning, Mrs. Simmons," she said formally. Though they had worked together for over a decade, the two women maintained the proprieties. "I trust all is in hand for today's meals?" The master particularly mentioned that Dr. Lancaster is fond of game pie. "Yes, Mrs. Wilson. I've planned a raised game pie for luncheon and woodcock for dinner. The menu is on Mr. Phelps's desk for your approval." "Very good. And is the servants' breakfast ready? They'll need to eat promptly if we're to maintain the schedule today." As the two senior servants discussed the day's arrangements, the younger staff continued their work, knowing that in less than an hour, the upper servants would arrive for their breakfast, followed by the arrival of the valets and ladies' maids who served the family directly. The day had barely begun, and already the hidden machinery of the great house was humming with activity, invisible to the family who still slept peacefully above. The servants' hall adjoined the kitchen, a long room dominated by a wooden table that could seat 20. Unlike the grandly appointed dining room upstairs, this was a functional space with plain whitewashed walls, a stone floor, and benches rather than chairs. The only concession to comfort was a fireplace at one end, which Thomas had lit an hour earlier. At precisely 6 o'clock, the servants began to assemble for breakfast. They entered and sat according to a strict hierarchy that mirrored the structure of the household above. At the head of the table sat Mr. Phelps, with Mrs. Wilson to his right. Next came Mrs. Simmons and Mr. Barrow, the butler, followed by Miss Phillips, the lady's maid to Mrs. Thornfield, and Mr. Green, valet to the master. The lower servants filled the remaining seats, with the scullery maid Jenny perched at the very foot of the table. Breakfast was simple but hearty: porridge with treacle, bread with butter, and strong tea. The upper servants received eggs as well, a small privilege of their position. Conversation was minimal and primarily concerned the day's duties. "We have the Lancasters arriving at 4 this afternoon," Mr. Phelps announced to the assembled staff. "Dr. Lancaster is an old friend of the master and a physician of some renown in London. Mrs. Lancaster will be with him. They will stay for 3 nights. He turned to Mr. Barrow. "The blue guest room has been prepared?" "Yes, Mr. Phelps," the butler replied. "I've had James and William air it thoroughly and build up the fire since yesterday. The bed was made up with the best linen yesterday afternoon." James and William were the 2 footmen, young men chosen partly for their height and appearance, as they were the most visible male servants to the family and guests. They stood behind the family at mealtimes, answered the door, carried heavy items, and added to the prestige of the household by their mere presence. At the moment, they sat silently, knowing their duties for the day would be particularly scrutinized with important guests arriving. Mr. Phelps continued, "Dr. Lancaster travels with his own valet, who will require accommodation in the men's quarters. Mrs. Lancaster's lady's maid will take the small room next to Miss Phillips." Miss Phillips, A thin woman in her 30s with a perpetually pinched expression nodded slightly. As lady's maid, she occupied a curious position in the household hierarchy, technically lower than the cook and housekeeper, but with special privileges due to her close association with the mistress. She dressed in black like the other female servants, but was permitted a small touch of lace at her collar and wore no cap over her tightly arranged hair. "The carriage will need to meet the 4 o'clock train," Mr. Phelps said to Mr. Miller, the coachman, who nodded. Like the gardeners, the coachman lived in separate quarters near the stables, but joined the household staff for main meals. "And what of young Master George's birthday tomorrow?" Mrs. Wilson inquired. Mrs. Thornfield mentioned a special cake. "Yes," Mrs. Simmons interjected. "I've planned a Victoria sponge with raspberry preserve. Miss Margaret requested it specially for her brother." The servants ate quickly. Lingering at meals was not permitted, regardless of one's station. By 6:30, the lower servants had already returned to their duties. The scullery maid, Jenny, was back at her sink. The kitchen maids were preparing the family's breakfast, and Thomas was hauling coal to the morning room and dining room fires. The housemaids, under the direction of Sarah, the head housemaid, began their morning cleaning routine. At 25, Sarah had 7 years of experience at Thornfield and supervised 3 younger maids. Their first task was to clear and clean the grates in the family rooms, a messy job that had to be completed before the family awoke. Equipped with small brushes, dustpans, and buckets, the housemaids entered the darkened morning room. Sarah showed the newest maid, Martha, the proper technique. Kneeling before the grate in a protective canvas apron, she carefully removed the cinders and ashes, separating usable cinders for reuse. The ash went into a covered bucket to be disposed of later. The grate was then blackleaded and polished to a high shine, a difficult, messy job that left even experienced maids with blackened hands, despite their best efforts. "Be quick but thorough," Sarah instructed. "The family will be down at 8, and every room must be perfect by then." After the grates were cleaned, the maids moved on to dusting, sweeping, and polishing. Furniture was dusted with soft cloths, floors were swept with hair brooms, and brass fixtures were polished with special paste. In the dining room, particular attention was paid to the mahogany table, which had to gleam for breakfast. The crystal and silver on the sideboard received a final polish with a chamois leather. Meanwhile, upstairs, the family's personal servants were preparing for their employers to wake. In the master's dressing room, Mr. Green laid out William Thornfield's clothing for the day: a morning suit of dark gray, a white shirt with detachable collar, cufflinks, and studs. He prepared hot water for shaving and arranged the silver-backed brushes on the dressing table. Across the hallway, in the mistress's room, Miss Phillips performed similar duties for Mrs. Thornfield. She selected a morning dress of deep blue wool, with the appropriate undergarments laid out in the order they would be put on: chemise, corset, petticoats. She checked that the mistress's hair brushes were clean, and that her jewelry box contained the simple pearl earrings she favored for daytime. In the nursery on the 3rd floor, Nurse Evans was already awake and supervising young George's morning routine. Though no longer a baby, at 7 years old, he still resided primarily in the nursery, seeing his parents at appointed times during the day. Nurse had been with the family since before George's birth and ruled her domain with firm kindness. "Wash your face properly, Master George," she instructed, watching as the boy reluctantly applied soap to his face at the nursery washstand. "Behind your ears too, if you please. Today's an important day with your birthday tomorrow and guests arriving." "Will Dr. Lancaster bring me a present, Nurse?" George asked hopefully. "That's not for me to say. "But it's very impolite to expect gifts," she replied, helping him into his day clothes, a sailor suit with knee-length trousers and a crisp white collar. At 14, Margaret was no longer under nurse's direct supervision, having graduated to her own bedroom and the care of Miss Barrett, her governess. Miss Barrett, a gentle woman of reduced circumstances in her 30s, occupied an ambiguous position in the household, neither family nor servant. She ate with the family when there were no guests, but was not truly considered their social equal. As the clock approached 7, the house was fully awake below stairs, while the family members still slept in their rooms above. The contrast was striking: frenzied activity in the servants' quarters versus peaceful slumber in the family chambers. Yet everything was orchestrated toward a single purpose: ensuring that when the family did rise, their world would appear to run effortlessly and perfectly, with no sign of the labor that made it possible. At precisely 8 o'clock, Mr. Green entered the master's bedroom after a soft knock. William Thornfield, at 45, had maintained the discipline of early rising that had served him well in managing the family's extensive manufacturing interests. He was already stirring as his valet opened the heavy curtains to admit the autumn morning light. "Good morning, sir," Mr. Green said quietly, moving to pour hot water into the porcelain basin on the washstand. "It's a clear day, though there was frost overnight. The temperature is approximately 40 degrees. "Thank you, Green," William replied, sitting up in the large mahogany four-poster bed. Like most married couples of their class, he and his wife Eleanor maintained separate bedrooms, connected by a shared dressing room. "Has there been any post yet?" "Not yet, sir. Mr. Phelps anticipates it will arrive with the boy from the village around 9 o'clock. William rose and moved to the washstand, splashing the warm water on his face while Green laid out shaving implements: a straight razor, badger hair brush, and soap in a silver cup. The valet then assisted his employer in his morning toilet, a ritual that included a careful shave, the application of a bay rum as an aftershave, and meticulous attention to the master's thick brown hair, now showing the first strands of gray at the temples. Across the hall, a similar scene unfolded in Mrs. Thornfield's bedroom, though with variations befitting a lady. Miss Phillips had entered at the same time as Mr. Green had attended to the master, but Mrs. Thornfield required more time to prepare for the day. At 38, Eleanor Thornfield maintained the slender figure of her youth, aided by a strict adherence to societal expectations and the firm compression of her corset. "Good morning, madam," Miss Phillips said, setting down a small tray containing a cup of hot chocolate, the mistress's preferred morning beverage. "I've laid out the blue wool dress as you requested, and the pearl earrings." "Thank you, Phillips," Eleanor replied, taking a small sip of chocolate before rising. "Please help me dress quickly. I want to check the arrangements for the Lancasters' arrival before breakfast." The process of dressing a lady of Eleanor's station was neither simple nor quick. First came the fine linen camise, followed by cotton drawers with delicate embroidery at the hem. Then the crucial item, the corset. Made of strong cotton coutil and reinforced with whalebone stays, it would reduce Eleanor's waist from its natural 28 inches to a fashionable 22. Miss Phillips positioned the corset around her mistress's torso and began the laborious process of tightening the laces, working methodically from bottom to top. "Not too tight today, Phillips," Eleanor instructed, holding onto the bedpost for support. "I have a slight headache, and I don't wish to feel faint." "Yes, madam," Phillips replied, though she knew that what the mistress considered not too tight would still appear painfully constraining to someone unaccustomed to such garments. When the corset was secured, next came the bustle. A metal and horsehair framework, that gave the fashionable silhouette its distinctive profile, followed by 3 petticoats of increasing fullness and quality. Finally, Phillips helped Eleanor into her morning dress, a high-necked blue wool garment with leg of mutton sleeves and a row of small buttons down the front. The dress was relatively simple by the standards of evening wear, but still required assistance to fasten the 30 tiny buttons that ran from neck to waist. After the dress came silk stockings and buttoned boots, which Phillips knelt to fasten. The final touch was Eleanor's hair. Unlike evening styles, which required elaborate arrangements, morning hair was relatively simple. Phillips brushed out her mistress's long brown hair, now showing a few strands of gray that would later be carefully disguised, and arranged it in a simple chignon at the nape of her neck. While their parents completed their morning preparations, the 3 Thornfield children were in various stages of readiness. Young George, already dressed and supervised by Nurse Evans, was having his breakfast in the nursery, porridge with milk and a soft-boiled egg. At 7, he still took most of his meals separately from the adults, joining the family table only for special occasions. 16-year-old James, the eldest son and heir to the Thornfield business and estate, was being attended by Robert, the second footman who served as his valet. Unlike his father, James was reluctant to rise early, and Robert had to employ increasing urgency in his attempts to wake the young man. "Master James, it's 8:30, Robert said, opening the curtains wide. "Your father will be at breakfast shortly, and you know he expects punctuality." James groaned and finally sat up, his hair tousled. "What's for breakfast today?" he asked, yawning. "Mrs. Simmons has prepared kedgeree, sir, as well as bacon, eggs, and kidneys," Robert replied, helping James into his dressing gown. Unlike his father, James did not yet rate a full valet, and received somewhat less elaborate assistance, though still far more than most people outside the upper classes would ever experience. Margaret, at 14, occupied a middle position between childhood and adulthood. No longer confined to the nursery but not yet a debutante, she was dressed by Mary, a young housemaid assigned to assist her. Her morning dress was similar to her mother's, but simpler in design and lighter in color, with fewer undergarments and a less restrictive corset. "Miss Barrett says we'll continue with French verbs this morning," Mary reported as she brushed Margaret's long hair. "And she asked me to remind you to bring your composition book." Margaret sighed. "I'd much rather practice the piano today. We have guests coming, and Mother might ask me to play after dinner." "I'm sure Miss Barrett will allow time for practice, miss," Mary replied diplomatically, securing Margaret's hair with ribbons that matched her pale green dress. By 8:45, the family began to assemble in the dining room for breakfast. William arrived first, followed shortly by Eleanor. James hurried in just as the clock struck 9, earning a disapproving glance from his father, but no verbal reprimand in front of the servants. Margaret joined them a few minutes later, perfectly composed despite her youth. The dining room exemplified Victorian affluence and taste. A large mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by 12 matching chairs upholstered in deep red leather. The walls were covered in dark green flock wallpaper with an embossed pattern, while a massive sideboard displayed the family's silver. A crystal chandelier hung above the table, though it remained unlit at breakfast when natural light from the tall windows sufficed. Mr. Barrow supervised breakfast service, with James and William, the 2 footmen, standing at attention behind the family's chairs. The meal was served à la Russe, with dishes presented sequentially rather than all at once, a style that had become fashionable in the 1860s after being introduced by the Russian ambassador to France. The sideboard held chafing dishes keeping various offerings warm, kedgeree, a dish of rice, flaked fish, and hard-boiled eggs that reflected the influence of the Empire on British cuisine, bacon, kidneys, and eggs. Toast racks contained perfectly browned bread, while silver pots held coffee and tea. Unlike dinner, breakfast allowed some element of choice, with family members indicating their preferences to the footmen, who served them accordingly. Conversation during breakfast was minimal and primarily functional, focusing on the day's schedule rather than anything substantive. "I've instructed Miller to have the carriage ready at 3:30 to meet the 4 o'clock train," William informed his wife, speaking between precise bites of kidney. "Lancaster wrote that they'll be arriving on the London Express." "Very good," Eleanor replied. "I've had Mrs. Wilson prepare the blue room. Mrs. Lancaster mentioned in her last letter that she finds blue restful, and the morning sun in that room is not too harsh." "James," William continued, turning to his son, "I expect you to be present when the Lancasters arrive. Dr. Lancaster knew you as a child and will want to see how you've grown." "Yes, father," James replied, helping himself to more kedgeree. "Will I be excused from Greek lessons with Reverend Phillips this afternoon, then?" "Until 4 o'clock only," his father replied firmly. "The Reverend will expect you at 2 as usual." To Margaret, Eleanor said, "I'd like you to play for us after dinner tonight, dear. Perhaps that Chopin nocturne you've been practicing." Margaret nodded, pleased that her earlier wish would be fulfilled. "Yes, Mother. Miss Barrett has promised me an hour of practice time this afternoon." As the family ate, the servants maintained a careful ballet of service. The footmen stood at attention, moving only to serve or clear dishes. Mr. Barrow supervised with minute attention to detail, his eyes missing nothing. When William's coffee cup was 3/4 empty, James the footman stepped forward to refill it without being asked. When Eleanor delicately dabbed her lips with her napkin, William the footman appeared at her side to offer more toast, which she declined with a small shake of her head. Meanwhile, below stairs, the kitchen was already in the midst of preparing luncheon and planning for dinner. Mrs. Simmons had the kitchen maids preparing a raised game pie, a complex creation involving a hot water pastry crust shaped around a wooden mold, filled with layers of pheasant, partridge, and rabbit, each separated by thin slices of bacon and seasoned with herbs from the kitchen garden. The pie would be served cold at luncheon, so it needed to be completed by mid-morning to have time to set. By 10 o'clock, the family had finished breakfast and dispersed to their morning activities. William withdrew to his study to review business correspondence before riding out to inspect some of his tenants' farms. Eleanor retired to the morning room, where Mrs. Wilson awaited her with the household accounts and menus for approval. James reluctantly joined his tutor, Reverend Phillips, in the library for his morning lessons in Latin and Greek, while Margaret went upstairs to the schoolroom, where Miss Barrett had prepared a morning of French verbs and English composition. As the family dispersed, the real work of maintaining the household continued unabated, invisible but essential to the smooth functioning of Thornfield Manor. In the morning room, Eleanor Thornfield sat at a small rosewood desk, reviewing the household accounts that Mrs. Wilson had presented in a leather-bound ledger. This daily meeting between mistress and housekeeper was a crucial part of household management, where decisions were made, expenditures approved, and the smooth operation of the domestic sphere ensured. "The butcher's bill seems rather high this month, Mrs. Wilson," Eleanor remarked, her finger tracing down a column of neatly written figures. "Has there been an increase in prices?" "Yes, madam," Mrs. Wilson replied, standing respectfully by the desk. "Mr. Hobbs has raised his prices by a penny per pound on beef. I have made inquiries with other suppliers, but his quality remains superior, particularly for a household of this standing. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Like most women of her class, she had been raised to manage a household efficiently, and while she delegated the daily operations to her housekeeper, she maintained firm control over expenditures and standards. The household accounts were no small matter. The annual budget for Thornfield Manor exceeded the lifetime earnings of most of the servants who worked there. Very well, she decided. We shall continue with Mr. Hobbs for now, but perhaps suggest to him that we may consider alternatives if prices rise further. She turned a page in the ledger. Now, about the menus for the Lancasters' visit. While this conversation continued, the morning room itself was a testament to the feminine domain in Victorian domestic architecture. Unlike the darker, heavier study where William conducted his business affairs, the morning room was decorated in lighter colors. Pale blue walls with delicate silver stripes, white painted woodwork, and curtains of cream silk embroidered with small blue flowers. The furniture was elegant but comfortable. A small sofa and several armchairs upholstered in pale yellow, occasional tables of polished rosewood, and a piano in the corner where Margaret practiced under her mother's supervision. The room faced east to catch the morning light that now streamed through tall windows, illuminating the collection of delicate ornaments on the mantelpiece. Staffordshire figurines, miniature portraits in gilt frames, and a small French clock that chimed the quarter hours with a silvery tone. Fresh flowers from the greenhouse stood in a crystal vase on a central table. Late roses and early chrysanthemums arranged that morning by Eleanor herself, one of the few household tasks she performed personally. Elsewhere in the house, the business of the day continued. In the vast kitchens, Mrs. Simmons supervised the completion of the game pie while simultaneously beginning preparations for dinner. The woodcock that would be the main course needed to be plucked and dressed, a task requiring considerable skill that she entrusted only to herself or to Alice, her most experienced kitchen maid. You must be careful not to rupture the intestines, she instructed, demonstrating the proper technique. Unlike other game birds, woodcock are not drawn before roasting. The trail, the intestines, gives the flesh its distinctive flavor, but it must remain intact during cooking. Alice watched carefully, aware that such instruction was valuable. Kitchen skills were highly transferable, and a maid who could progress to cook could command better wages and conditions. Mrs. Simmons, despite her sometimes harsh manner, was known to be an excellent teacher, and several of her former kitchen maids now served as cooks in other substantial households. The kitchen was a hive of activity. Jenny scrubbed copper pots with salt and vinegar until they gleamed, the harsh chemicals reddening her already chapped hands. Betsy prepared vegetables for both luncheon and dinner, peeling potatoes, trimming green beans, and shelling peas. The physical labor was constant and demanding, and the heat from the range made the kitchen uncomfortably warm even on this cool autumn day. Above stairs, the housemaids worked steadily through the unoccupied rooms, cleaning methodically according to a schedule established by Mrs. Wilson. Each bedroom required approximately 45 minutes of work, changing linens, dusting furniture, polishing mirrors, sweeping carpets with tea leaves to collect dust, and emptying chamber pots and ewers. The latter task, dealing with the night soil, was one of the least pleasant aspects of a housemaid's duties, especially in a house like Thornfield, which had not yet been modernized with indoor water closets on the bedroom floors. Sarah, the head housemaid, supervised Martha, the newest addition to the staff, in the blue guest room that would accommodate the Lancasters. The sheet must be tucked precisely at the corners, she demonstrated, her quick hands creating neat hospital corners with practiced efficiency. and the counterpane must hang exactly 12 inches from the floor on all sides. Martha, red-faced with exertion and concentration, attempted to mimic Sarah's technique. At 16, she had been in service only 6 months, having come from a tenant farmer's family on the Thornfield estate. The position was considered a good opportunity. The work was hard, but the pay was regular, the food adequate, and there was the possibility of advancement for those who proved capable and obedient. "When you dust," Sarah continued, "always start at the top of a piece of furniture and work down. And remember to move, not merely rearrange the dust." She demonstrated with a soft cloth on the mahogany dressing table, her movements efficient and thorough. The mistress often runs her finger along the picture rails to check for dust, so be particularly careful there. In the library, James Thornfield struggled with his Greek translation under the stern gaze of Reverend Phillips, the local vicar who supplemented his income by tutoring the son of the area's most prominent family. At 40, the Reverend was a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair and spectacles that he habitually peered over rather than through. "Your declensions are still weak, Master James," he observed critically. "How do you expect to pass the entrance examinations for Cambridge if you cannot properly decline a simple Greek noun?" James suppressed a sigh. The expectations placed upon him as the heir to the Thornfield name and fortune were considerable. Unlike his father, who had built upon his grandfather's industrial success with enthusiasm and aptitude, James harbored secret doubts about his suitability for the role fate had assigned him. His true interests lay in the natural sciences, particularly the new field of evolutionary biology that had caused such controversy since Darwin's publications. But such pursuits were considered suitable only as gentlemanly hobbies, not as serious occupations for someone of his position. "I'll work harder, sir," he replied automatically, though both he and the Reverend knew the promise was likely to remain unfulfilled. James was not lazy. Rather, his energies were simply directed elsewhere than the classical education his father insisted upon. In the schoolroom on the 3rd floor, Margaret's morning followed a different pattern. Under Miss Barrett's guidance, she worked through French verb conjugations, practiced her handwriting, and composed a short essay on the virtues of charity. Though less rigorous than her brother's classical education, Margaret's curriculum was designed to make her an accomplished young lady who could converse intelligently, but not too intelligently, on a range of suitable topics, play the piano and sing acceptably, and eventually manage a household of her own. Miss Barrett, at 35, represented a common Victorian type, the genteel spinster of good family, but limited means, who supported herself through teaching. The daughter of a clergyman whose death had left his family in reduced circumstances, she had been educated at a ladies' academy and had served as governess to several families before coming to Thornfield 5 years earlier. Her position was ambiguous, neither servant nor family member, and often lonely, but it provided security and respectability, the primary concerns for a woman of her background. "Your penmanship is improving, Margaret," she observed, examining her pupil's careful copperplate script. "But do be mindful of your posture. A lady should sit erect, even when writing." Margaret straightened her back obediently, though she longed to slouch as she did when alone. The steel stays of her corset, lighter than her mother's, but still restrictive, pressed against her ribs, as a constant reminder of the physical discipline expected of a young lady of her class. Meanwhile, in the nursery, young George's morning proceeded under Nurse Evans's watchful eye. At 7, he was still considered too young for formal schooling, though he received daily lessons in reading, simple arithmetic, and Bible stories. This morning, however, with his birthday approaching, he was permitted extra playtime with his prized possession, a wooden fort complete with lead soldiers, a recent gift from his father. "The British forces are attacking the Zulu warriors. Nurse!" he exclaimed, arranging his soldiers in battle formation. "Captain Smith will lead the charge." Nurse Evans smiled indulgently. At 50, she had raised 2 generations of Thornfield children and knew that George's martial games were a normal part of boyhood for his class, preparing him for the possibility of military or colonial service that awaited many younger sons of the gentry. Unlike his brother James, George would not inherit the family business or estate. His future would likely lie in the army, the church, or perhaps the colonial administration. All respectable careers for a gentleman's son without independent means. "Very good, Master George," she replied, her hands busy with mending one of his shirts. "But remember that at 11 o'clock you're to go down to the stables. Your father has instructed Mr. Miller to begin your riding lessons today." "Yes, nurse," George replied enthusiastically. Riding lessons represented an important step toward manhood in his world, and he had been eagerly anticipating this milestone for months. As noon approached, the household began to shift its rhythms toward luncheon. Below stairs, the servants' dining room was set for the senior staff's midday meal, while the kitchen maids and lower servants would eat quickly in shifts to maintain the workflow. Above stairs, the family would gather in the dining room for a meal less formal than dinner, but still served with considerable ceremony. The morning's activities, from Eleanor's household management to James's reluctant studies, from the servants' cleaning to the kitchen's food preparation, all represented the intricately choreographed dance of daily life in a Victorian household of means. Each person knew their place and role, performing it with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but with the shared understanding that the smooth functioning of the household depended on everyone fulfilling their appointed tasks. At noon, the brass gong in the main hall was struck by William the footman, its resonant tones signaling that luncheon would be served in 15 minutes. The family began to gather in the drawing room before proceeding to the dining room. Luncheon at Thornfield Manor, as in most upper-class Victorian households, occupied a middle ground between the relative informality of breakfast and the rigid ceremony of dinner. It was primarily a meal for the women and children of the house, as William, like many men of his station, typically ate luncheon at his club or office in town. Today, however, being Saturday, he was present, having returned from his morning ride to inspect the tenant farms on the northern boundaries of the estate. "The Miller's roof will need repairs before winter," he informed Eleanor as they took their seats at the dining table. "I've instructed Bennett to send men from the estate workshop next week." Eleanor nodded approvingly. Such maintenance matters were ultimately her husband's responsibility, but she took a proper interest, as befitted the mistress of a large property. "Very good. Mrs. Miller mentioned the leak when she brought eggs last market day. I'm sure they'll be grateful for the prompt attention." The dining room, so recently vacated after breakfast, had been reset for luncheon. The white damask tablecloth remained, but the breakfast silver had been removed, cleaned, and replaced with the luncheon service. Fresh flowers from the conservatory now graced the center of the table, chrysanthemums in deep burgundy and gold, reflecting the autumn season. James and Margaret joined their parents, with George making a rare appearance at the family table in honor of his approaching birthday. Normally, he would have taken luncheon in the nursery with Nurse Evans, but Eleanor believed in gradually introducing children to proper mealtime etiquette, well before they would be expected to dine regularly with adults. "Remember your posture, George," she gently reminded him as he fidgeted in his chair. "A gentleman sits straight with his napkin on his lap." George straightened immediately, his small face serious as he adjusted his napkin. At 7, he was already acutely aware of the expectations placed upon him as a Thornfield, and eager to prove himself worthy of joining the adult table. The luncheon menu was substantial by modern standards, but considered relatively light for the period. The centerpiece was the raised game pie that Mrs. Simmons had prepared that morning, its golden brown crust decorated with pastry leaves and an impressive centerpiece fashioned to resemble a pheasant. This was accompanied by boiled potatoes with parsley butter, glazed carrots, and a salad of cucumber and radishes, dressed with oil and vinegar. Mr. Barrow supervised the service, with James and William the footmen standing at attention, ready to serve each dish. The family ate in the continental style, keeping the fork in the left hand and the knife in the right throughout the meal, rather than switching as was common in America. Conversation remained light and primarily concerned domestic matters. "Miss Barrett informs me that your French composition was particularly good this week, Margaret," Eleanor said, accepting a thin slice of game pie from the footman's silver server. "Thank you, Mother," Margaret replied, pleased with the recognition. It was a description of a garden in spring. "Miss Barrett has been helping me with my descriptive vocabulary." "Very good," William nodded approvingly. "A proper facility with French is essential for a young lady. You'll find it invaluable during your continental tour." The continental tour was still years away, a traditional finishing experience for young ladies of Margaret's class, who would travel through Europe with a chaperone to perfect their languages, study art and music, and generally acquire the polish expected of a well-bred Englishwoman before making their societal debut. "James," William continued, turning to his son, "Reverend Phillips reports that your Greek translation still requires improvement." James suppressed a sigh. "Yes, Father, I'm applying myself to it." "See that you do. Dr. Lancaster was a noted classical scholar before turning to medicine, and he may wish to discuss Homer with you." The meal progressed through its courses. After the game pie came a lemon pudding served with custard sauce, followed by a selection of cheeses with biscuits. Unlike dinner, which might include up to a dozen courses, luncheon was relatively brief, usually consisting of 3 or 4 dishes at most. As the meal concluded, Eleanor turned to her husband. "I understand Mrs. Whitby and her daughter will be calling this afternoon. Would you care to receive them, or shall I make your excuses?" William barely concealed his relief. Afternoon calls were a vital part of the social fabric that bound together the local gentry, but they were primarily considered women's business. "I believe I should review some papers from the mill before the Lancasters arrive. Please convey my regrets to Mrs. Whitby." "Of course," Eleanor replied, understanding perfectly. The intricate dance of social calls, which required that families of similar standing regularly visit one another, according to a complex schedule of appropriate days and times, was largely orchestrated by the women of each household. These visits, though often characterized by stilted conversation and rigid formality, were essential for maintaining one's place in society and for the exchange of information and gossip that kept the community functioning. As the family rose from the table, they dispersed to their afternoon activities. William retired to his study, a masculine sanctuary with leather-upholstered furniture, dark wood paneling, and the distinctive aroma of pipe tobacco. Here he would review business correspondence and perhaps enjoy a brief nap, never acknowledged but tacitly accepted as part of a gentleman's daily routine. Eleanor withdrew to her bedroom for a brief rest before the afternoon callers would arrive. This short period of repose was considered essential for a lady's health and complexion. Miss Phillips helped her remove her morning dress and corset, replacing them with a loose dressing gown. For perhaps half an hour, Eleanor would lie on her bed, sometimes reading a chapter from a novel or periodical, but often simply closing her eyes and allowing her body to recover from the constant compression of her corset. James returned reluctantly to the library for his afternoon lessons with Reverend Phillips, while Margaret went to the music room for her promised piano practice. George, excited about his first riding lesson, was escorted to the stables by Thomas, the hall boy temporarily assigned to this duty. Below stairs, the kitchen staff worked frantically to clean up from luncheon, while simultaneously preparing for afternoon tea and the elaborate dinner that would follow. The remains of the game pie were carefully wrapped and stored in the cool pantry. Nothing was wasted in even the wealthiest Victorian household, and the leftover game would appear in a different form on the servants' table that evening. Mrs. Simmons inspected the woodcock that would be the centerpiece of dinner, ensuring they had been properly prepared. "These need to hang for another hour," she instructed Alice. "Then we'll start the roasting. The master likes his game properly high, but not overpowering." In Victorian cuisine, game birds were often hung for several days after being shot to develop the strong, gamey flavor that was prized by connoisseurs. Modern diners might find the taste too strong, even slightly decayed, but to the Victorian palate, it represented the height of culinary sophistication. At 1:30, the first afternoon callers arrived. The Whitby carriage, a modest brougham pulled by a single horse, deposited Mrs. Whitby and her daughter Charlotte at the front entrance of Thornfield Manor. William the footman opened the door and accepted their calling cards on a silver salver, then escorted them to the drawing room, where Eleanor, having changed into an afternoon dress of lavender silk with black lace trim, awaited them. The drawing room was Thornfield's most formal reception space, decorated in the height of Victorian opulence. The walls were covered in crimson flock wallpaper, with a raised pattern of flowers and vines. Heavy curtains of matching crimson, elaborately swagged and fringed, framed the tall windows. The furniture represented an eclectic mix of styles. A French settee upholstered in gold silk brocade, several balloon-backed chairs arranged for conversation, occasional tables crowded with ornaments, and a grand piano in the corner. Every surface held some decorative item: figurines, vases, miniatures, daguerreotypes in ornate frames, and the overall effect was one of rich, almost overwhelming, visual stimulation. "Mrs. Whitby, Miss Whitby, how delightful to see you," Eleanor greeted her visitors with practiced warmth. The Whitbys were minor gentry, the widow and daughter of a retired army colonel, and while not quite of the same social standing as the Thornfields, they were respectable neighbors whose calls must be properly received and returned. "Mrs. Thornfield, you are too kind to receive us," Mrs. Whitby replied, taking a seat on the settee indicated by her hostess. At 50, she was a plump, comfortable woman in half-mourning. Her husband had died 3 years earlier, and she had progressed from the solid black of deep mourning to the purples, grays, and subdued patterns appropriate for a widow who was gradually returning to society. Charlotte Whitby, at 20, was in her 3rd season, the annual period when young ladies of good family were presented to society in London with the hope of securing suitable marriages. Despite 2 seasons, she remained unwed, a fact that was beginning to cause her mother some anxiety. She was pretty in a conventional way, with fair hair and blue eyes, but lacked the dowry or connections that might have attracted a particularly advantageous match. "I understand you are expecting Dr. and Mrs. Lancaster today," Mrs. Whitby said, accepting a cup of tea from Eleanor. Afternoon tea was served on delicate china, spode with a Chinese-inspired pattern of blue pagodas and bridges, with silver teaspoons and sugar tongs completing the service. "Yes, they arrive on the 4 o'clock train," Eleanor confirmed, offering a plate of small cakes. "Dr. Lancaster is an old-school friend of my husband's." "How lovely," Mrs. Whitby nodded. "Dr. Lancaster has quite a reputation in London, I understand. Wasn't he physician to the Duke of Sutherland?" This exchange represented the careful information gathering that was a primary purpose of such social calls. Through seemingly casual conversation, visitors collected details about their neighbors' activities, connections, and status, which would then be disseminated through the local community via similar calls to other houses. "Indeed he was," Eleanor confirmed, adding a precise teaspoon of sugar to her cup. "Though he has recently reduced his practice to focus on his research. He has a particular interest in diseases of the lungs." The conversation continued in this vein for approximately half an hour, the standard duration for a formal call. Topics remained determinedly superficial. The weather, local activities, mutual acquaintances, and carefully curated family news. Politics, religion, money, and anything that might provoke strong emotions or disagreement were scrupulously avoided. As the visit neared its conclusion, Margaret was summoned to the drawing room to greet the visitors. At 14, she was still too young for formal social calls, but her appearance was part of her training in the social graces that would eventually be expected of her. She entered the room with perfect deportment, her back straight and her steps measured, and executed a small curtsy to Mrs. Whitby before taking a seat near her mother. "Miss Margaret, how you've grown," Mrs. Whitby exclaimed. "Charlotte, do you not think Miss Thornfield is becoming quite the young lady?" Charlotte smiled and agreed, though perhaps with less enthusiasm than her mother. As an unmarried young woman still on the marriage market, she might reasonably view Margaret, who would debut in a few years with the advantages of greater wealth and connections, as future competition. After a few minutes of conversation that included Margaret, the Whitbys rose to take their leave, having precisely observed the appropriate time limit for their call. "We must not tire you when you have guests arriving," Mrs. Whitby said, accepting Eleanor's hand. "Please convey our regards to Mr. Thornfield." "I shall indeed," Eleanor promised, "and we must have you to dinner before the season ends. Perhaps next month, when my brother and his wife are visiting from London." This invitation, casually extended, but carefully calculated, served multiple purposes. It acknowledged the Whitbys' social position as worthy of inclusion at the Thornfield table. It dangled the possibility of introducing Charlotte to new potential suitors from London. And it subtly reinforced the Thornfield's superior social position by reminding the Whitbys of their London connections. As the visitors departed, Eleanor glanced at the ornate French clock on the mantelpiece. It was nearly 3 o'clock. Time to make final preparations for the Lancasters' arrival. With a rustle of silk skirts, she left the drawing room to confer with Mrs. Wilson about the guest chambers and to change her dress yet again, this time into a more formal afternoon gown suitable for receiving distinguished visitors. The social machinery of Thornfield Manor continued its precisely calibrated operations, each cog and wheel, from the lowest scullery maid to the master himself, performing its designated function in the elaborate mechanism of Victorian upper-class life. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 2, the household shifted its focus toward the imminent arrival of the honored guests. Below stairs, activity intensified as final preparations were made to ensure that Dr. and Mrs. Lancaster would experience Thornfield hospitality at its finest. In the blue guest bedroom, Sarah, the head housemaid, conducted a final inspection. The four-poster bed was perfectly made with the finest Irish linen sheets, lavender-scented and pressed to crisp perfection. The counterpane of blue silk matched the blue damask curtains that framed the tall windows. A fire had been lit in the great hours earlier and was now burning steadily, taking the chill from the room. Sarah checked that the washstand was properly equipped. A large Staffordshire pitcher filled with fresh water, a matching basin, soap in a silver dish, and towels warmed on the rail before the fire. On the dressing table, she verified that the silverberg-backed brushes were polished to a high shine and that the pincushion was well supplied with pins of various sizes. "Martha," she instructed the younger maid, "make sure there are fresh candles in all the wall sconces and on the bedside tables, and check that the bell pull is functioning properly." The bell pull system was Thornfield's primary method of internal communication, a network of wires and pulleys that connected each room to the servants' hall, where a board of bells indicated which room required attention. Though some newer or more extensively renovated houses had begun to install speaking tubes or even electric bells, Thornfield maintained the traditional system that had served the household for decades. Martha tugged gently on the embroidered bell pull beside the bed, and moments later, a distant bell rang in the servants' hall far below. "It's working properly, Sarah," she confirmed. "Good. Now what else do we need to check?" Sarah quizzed her assistant. Hot water cans for the bed?" Martha suggested. "Yes, those will be brought up just before the guests retire," Sarah nodded approvingly. "And the chamber pot under the bed should be clean and have a doily over it," Martha continued, dropping to her knees to check this essential item of bedroom furniture. In a house without indoor water closets on the bedroom floors, these vessels were a necessity, especially during the night when a trip to the household's few water closets, located at the end of corridors or on lower floors, would be inconvenient and potentially hazardous in the dark. "Very good," Sarah confirmed. "And the Lancasters' maid and valet will need to know where to find extra blankets and pillows should their employers require them during the night." This thorough attention to detail was characteristic of a well-run Victorian household. The comfort of guests was paramount, not merely as a matter of hospitality, but as a reflection of the family's status and standards. A visiting lady's maid who reported back that the linens were less than immaculate or the fire inadequately maintained would damage the reputation of the household in wider society. Meanwhile, in the carriage house, Mr. Miller, the coachman, supervised the preparation of the Thornfield landau, a four-wheeled carriage with a top that could be folded down in fine weather. Today, with clouds threatening rain, the top would remain up, providing protection for the travelers on their journey from the railway station. "Polish those brass lamps again, Tom," he instructed the stable boy who assisted him. "I can still see smudges, and the doctor is a particular gentleman by all accounts." The pair of matched bay horses that would pull the landau had been groomed to gleaming perfection, their coats brushed until they shone, and their hooves blackened and polished. Even the harness had received special attention, with every brass fitting burnished and every leather strap oiled and supple. In the kitchen, preparations for afternoon tea were well underway. Though the Lancasters might be offered refreshments immediately upon arrival if they expressed a desire for them, the formal afternoon tea would be served in the drawing room at 5 o'clock. Mrs. Simmons had prepared an array of delicacies: tiny cucumber sandwiches with the crusts removed, eclairs filled with freshly whipped cream, madeleines scented with lemon, and seed cake, a traditional favorite that had been made the previous day to allow the flavors to mature. Alice shaped small scones that would be baked at the last minute to ensure freshness. Remember, they must be exactly the same size, Mrs. Simmons instructed, watching critically as the kitchen maid used a pastry cutter to create perfect circles of dough, and evenly spaced on the baking sheet so they rise properly. Upstairs in her bedroom, Eleanor Thornfield was changing her dress for the third time that day, assisted by Miss Phillips. The afternoon gown she had worn to receive the Whitbys was replaced by a more formal reception dress of deep burgundy silk with high neck, fitted bodice, and bustle adorned with elaborate pleating. Though not as formal as evening wear, this dress signaled the importance of the guests who would soon arrive. The jet earrings, I think, Phillips, Eleanor decided, inspecting her reflection in the tall cheval mirror. And perhaps the cameo brooch that Mr. Rapp Thornfield gave me for our anniversary. Miss Phillips silently produced the requested items from the jewelry box, a magnificent affair of burled walnut with silver fittings, and fastened them in place. The jet earrings, though considered appropriate for day wear, caught the light with a subtle gleam that enhanced Eleanor's dark eyes and carefully arranged hair. At 3:30, William emerged from his study, having changed into a frock coat, striped trousers, and a fresh shirt with a high, starched collar. Though less formal than evening dress, this attire was appropriate for receiving important guests and signaled his respect for the Lancasters. "Is everything prepared for our guests, my dear?" he asked, finding Eleanor in the drawing room, where she was making a final inspection of the room's appearance. "Yes, I believe so," she replied. "The blue room has been prepared as we discussed, and Mrs. Wilson has assigned one of the footmen to attend to Dr. Lancaster's needs. Tea will be served at 5, and I've instructed Barrow to have sherry available in the library should the doctor wish for something stronger." William nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Lancaster was always fond of a good sherry." He glanced at his pocket watch. "Miller should be leaving for the station shortly. I've asked James to join us in welcoming the Lancasters, and Margaret should be present as well, at least briefly." "Of course," Eleanor agreed. "I've already sent word to Miss Barrett. Margaret will come down as soon as she has changed her dress." This exchange, conducted with the formal courtesy that characterized even private interactions between husband and wife of their class, masked the genuine affection and respect that existed between the Thornfields. Theirs had been a marriage of compatibility rather than passion, arranged with the approval of both families when Eleanor was 20 and William 27. Over 18 years of marriage, they had developed a deep understanding and genuine fondness for one another, though they would never display this affection openly, even in private. At precisely 20 minutes to 4, Mr. Miller drove the landau down the long gravel drive of Thornfield Manor, the horses' hooves crunching rhythmically on the stone as they trotted toward the main gates. The carriage would take approximately 15 minutes to reach the railway station in the nearby village, arriving with a few minutes to spare before the London Express was due. Meanwhile, the Thornfield family assembled in the drawing room to await their guests. William stood before the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, while Eleanor sat gracefully on the French settee, her skirts arranged to display the pleating to advantage. James, looking uncomfortable in his formal clothes but resigned to his duty, stood near his father. Margaret, in a pale pink dress appropriate for a girl of her age, perched on a small chair near her mother, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap as she had been taught. "Remember, James," William instructed his son, "Dr. Lancaster knew you as a small child, so be prepared for him to remark on how you've grown. Express an interest in his medical research. He's doing important work on tuberculosis treatment." "Yes, father," James replied dutifully, though his expression suggested he was not looking forward to manufacturing enthusiasm for medical topics that held little interest for him. "And Margaret," Eleanor added, "you may remain for half an hour after the introductions. Then you will excuse yourself and return to the schoolroom until dinner. You may use the phrase we practiced." "Yes, Mother," Margaret nodded. "Please excuse me, as I must return to my studies, but I look forward to seeing you at dinner," she recited, her voice carefully modulated to be audible but not too loud, the proper tone for a young lady addressing her elders. As the clock approached 4, the family fell silent, listening for the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel that would herald the arrival of their guests. The drawing room, with its crimson wallpaper and heavy furnishings, felt particularly formal in the afternoon light that filtered through the tall windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air despite the housemaid's best efforts. At 5 minutes past 4, the distant sound of hooves and wheels announced the carriage's return. William straightened almost imperceptibly, checking that his watch chain was properly arranged across his waistcoat. Eleanor smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her skirt and exchanged a quick glance with her husband, a private moment of communication before their public performance began. The front door opened, and they heard Mr. Barrow's dignified voice welcoming the guests. Footsteps approached the drawing room, and then the butler appeared at the door. "Dr. and Mrs. Henry Lancaster," he announced formally, stepping aside to allow the visitors to enter. Dr. Lancaster was a tall, distinguished man in his mid-40s, with graying hair at his temples and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to respect. His wife, Amelia, was perhaps 5 years younger, an elegant woman in a traveling costume of dark green wool, her auburn hair arranged in a fashionable style beneath a small hat adorned with a single feather. "Lancaster!" William stepped forward, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "How good to see you after so long." "Thornfield, my dear fellow," Dr. Lancaster replied, grasping the offered hand firmly. "It's been far too long. And Mrs. Thornfield," he continued, turning to Eleanor, who had risen to greet her guests, "you are as lovely as ever." The ritual of introduction and reintroduction continued, William presenting his children to the guests, Eleanor expressing her delight at finally meeting Mrs. Lancaster after years of correspondence, the guests making appropriate comments about the house and the journey. This choreographed social dance, with its prescribed steps and expected phrases, served an important function in Victorian society, establishing and reinforcing connections while providing a comfortable framework for interaction even between relative strangers. "You must be tired after your journey," Eleanor said to Mrs. Lancaster. "Would you care for refreshment now, or would you prefer to rest before tea is served at 5? "A brief rest would be most welcome," Mrs. Lancaster replied graciously. The train journey was comfortable, but one does feel the need to freshen up after traveling. "Of course," Eleanor nodded, pulling the bell pull to summon a servant. "I'll have you shown to your room immediately. We've prepared the blue room, which I hope you'll find comfortable." When the footman appeared in response to the bell, Eleanor instructed him to inform Mrs. Wilson that the guests had arrived and to have them escorted to their room. Within moments, the housekeeper appeared, her bunch of keys jingling softly at her waist. "Dr. and Mrs. Lancaster, welcome to Thornfield Manor," she said with a deferential nod. "If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your room." As the guests departed with Mrs. Wilson, the Thornfield family relaxed slightly. The initial reception had gone well, with no social missteps or awkward moments. Now the household would shift to its next phase, as the Lancasters settled into their room and prepared for the evening's activities. "They seem in good spirits," William observed to his wife. Lancaster looks well. London practice evidently agreed. Mrs. Lancaster is charming, Eleanor agreed. I look forward to getting better acquainted during her stay. The arrival of guests at a house like Thornfield set in motion a complex series of activities both above and below stairs. In the kitchen, Mrs. Simmons would now finalize the dinner menu, knowing exactly who would be at the table. The housemaids would make a final check of the guest room once the Lancasters had gone down for tea. The footman would ensure that luggage was delivered promptly and that the doctor's valet and Mrs. Lancaster's lady's maid were properly accommodated in the servants' quarters. Every aspect of the household, from the arrangement of dinner seating to the temperature of the bathwater, would be adjusted to account for the presence of these important visitors. The social ritual of the country house visit, with its elaborate etiquette and unspoken rules, had begun. The Lancasters' arrival initiated a brief lull in the public areas of Thornfield Manor, as the guests retired to their room to rest and refresh themselves before afternoon tea. This pause, however, masked intensified activity in other parts of the house, particularly below stairs, where preparations for the evening's entertainments shifted into higher gear. In the blue guest room, Mrs. Lancaster sighed with relief as her lady's maid, Stevens, unfastened the hooks of her traveling costume. "Thank goodness to be out of that dress," she murmured. "The dust from the railway clings to everything, no matter how careful one is." Stevens, a woman of about 40 who had served Miss Lancaster for 8 years, worked efficiently to help her mistress out of her multiple layers of clothing. The traveling costume consisted of a bodice and skirt of dark green wool, high-necked and trimmed with black braid in a military style that was currently fashionable. Beneath this were the usual undergarments: camise, corset, petticoats, and bustle. "Would Madame prefer the gray silk for dinner, or the purple satin?" Stevens inquired, already unpacking the trunks that had been brought up by the footman. "The purple, I think," Mrs. Lancaster decided, standing in her corset and petticoat as Stevens draped a dressing gown around her shoulders. "And I'll wear the amethyst parure that Dr. Lancaster gave me for our anniversary." While this conversation occurred, Dr. Lancaster was similarly attended by his valet, Parker, though with less extensive disrobing. The doctor merely removed his traveling coat and waistcoat, allowing Parker to brush them thoroughly to remove the railway dust before dinner. "Will you require a bath before dinner, sir?" Parker inquired, knowing his employer's preferences but following the protocol of asking. "Yes, I believe so," Dr. Lancaster replied, sitting in an armchair by the fire. "Perhaps at 6:30? That should allow adequate time to dress for dinner at 8. "Very good, sir. I'll inform the footman." Parker moved to the bell pull and rang for service, knowing that in a well-run household like Thornfield, a bath would involve multiple servants. Footmen to carry the hot water up from the kitchen, a housemaid to lay out fresh towels, and possibly even the butler to ensure that everything was properly arranged for such an important guest. The Blue Room, like most guest accommodations in houses of Thornfield's era and status, did not have an attached bathroom or water closet. Indoor plumbing was still a relatively recent innovation in 1878, and while Thornfield had been modernized with water closets on each floor, located at the end of corridors for shared use, baths remained portable affairs that were brought to the bedroom when required. As the Lancasters settled into their room, a parallel scene of personal care was unfolding in the family quarters. William Thornfield, having welcomed his guests, retired briefly to his dressing room, where Mr. Green prepared a basin of hot water, shaving soap, and a freshly stropped razor. "Will you shave again before dinner, sir?" the valet inquired, knowing that some gentlemen preferred a second shave in the evening. particularly when entertaining guests. Yes, I believe so, William decided, inspecting his reflection in the mirror. And I'll wear the new evening tailcoat that arrived from London last week. For gentlemen, evening dress was rigorously standardized. Black tailcoat, white Marcella waistcoat, starched white shirt with detachable collar and cuffs, black trousers with a silk stripe down the outer seam, and a white bow tie. The only permissible variations lay in subtle details of cut and fabric quality, which to the initiated eye spoke volumes about the wearer's taste and means. In her dressing room, Eleanor conferred with Miss Phillips about her evening attire. Evening dress for ladies allowed for far more variety than gentlemen's, with choices of color, fabric, and adornment that expressed individual taste and status. The burgundy velvet, I think, Eleanor decided, referring to a dinner gown she had worn only twice before, with the Brussels lace at the neckline and sleeves. Miss Phillips nodded approvingly. An excellent choice, madam. And perhaps the pearl and diamond necklace? Yes, and the matching earrings. We should present a proper appearance for Dr. Lancaster. He moves in the highest circles in London, you know. This careful attention to appearance was not merely vanity. In Victorian society, proper dress was a matter of respect, both self-respect and respect for one's guests and family. To appear at dinner improperly or insufficiently attired would suggest a lack of regard for the occasion and the company. At 5 o'clock precisely, the Lancasters descended to the drawing room for afternoon tea, having rested and changed into fresh clothing. Mrs. Lancaster now wore a tea gown of lavender silk, less formal than evening wear, but more elegant than a day dress. Dr. Lancaster had changed into a black frock coat and gray trousers, the appropriate attire for a gentleman in the late afternoon. The Thornfield family received them in the drawing room, where Eleanor presided over the tea table with its silver service and delicate china. A maid had lit the fire earlier, and the room was comfortably warm as the afternoon light began to fade outside the tall windows. Mrs. Lancaster, do sit here by the fire, Eleanor invited, indicating a chair positioned for both warmth and conversation. I hope you found your room comfortable? Most comfortable, thank you, Mrs. Lancaster replied, taking the offered seat. The view of the gardens is charming, even at this season. Eleanor began the ritual of tea-making, measuring loose tea from a silver caddy into the silver teapot, which a footman then filled with boiling water from a silver kettle kept hot over a small spirit lamp. The tea would steep for precisely 5 minutes before being poured through a silver strainer into the waiting cups. While the tea steeped, the footman offered a 3-tiered stand containing an assortment of delicacies. Tiny cucumber sandwiches on the bottom tier, freshly baked scones with clotted cream and strawberry preserve in the middle, and an assortment of small cakes and pastries on the top. Dr. Lancaster, do try one of the eclairs, Eleanor suggested. Mrs. Simmons, our cook, is particularly skilled with choux pastry. The conversation during afternoon tea followed well-established patterns, focusing on mutual acquaintances, recent cultural events, and carefully selected news items that could be discussed without risk of controversy. Politics, religion, and money were scrupulously avoided, as were personal matters that might cause discomfort. I understand from your letter that young George's birthday is tomorrow, Mrs. Lancaster said to Eleanor. He must be excited. Indeed he is. Eleanor smiled. 7 is such a delightful age, old enough for some independence, but still sweetly childish in many ways. We've brought a small gift for him, Mrs. Lancaster added. Nothing elaborate, but Henry remembered how fond George was of soldiers when we last visited. How thoughtful of you, Eleanor replied warmly. George will be thrilled. He's quite devoted to his regiment of lead soldiers. As the ladies conversed, William and Dr. Lancaster engaged in their own discussion at the other end of the room, their topics ranging from developments in London medical circles to the management of the Thornfield manufacturing interests. James, having fulfilled his duty of greeting the guests, had been permitted to return to his studies, while Margaret had withdrawn after the prescribed half-hour, executing her rehearsed exit line with perfect composure. Below stairs, the household continued its preparations for the evening. In the kitchen, Mrs. Simmons directed the final preparations for dinner, a formal affair that would showcase the household's culinary capabilities. The menu had been planned days in advance, but could be adjusted based on the success of the day's hunting or the arrival of fresh ingredients from the kitchen garden or local suppliers. The woodcock should be perfectly roasted, she instructed Alice, who would be responsible for this crucial dish. 20 minutes is sufficient. They must be served slightly underdone, rather than overcooked. In Victorian hot cuisine, game birds were often served rare by modern standards, allowing the rich, gamey flavor to dominate. The woodcock would be roasted whole, including the intestines, which were considered a delicacy, and served with their long beaks piercing their own brains. A dramatic presentation that emphasized the bird's wild nature. Other dishes were in various stages of preparation. A clear soup of game consommé simmering gently to reduce and concentrate its flavor. A fish course of poached salmon with hollandaise sauce. Entrees of sweetbreads in puff pastry cases, and a vol au vent of chicken, and various vegetables, each prepared separately and with meticulous attention to detail. The dessert course would feature both a hot soufflé, a technically demanding dish that demonstrated Mrs. Simmons's skill, and a cold Charlotte Russe, a molded cream and sponge cake creation that had been prepared the previous day and was setting in the cool pantry. In the butler's pantry, Mr. Barrow personally inspected the silver that would grace the dinner table. Though already polished to a high shine by the footmen under his supervision, he examined each piece critically, occasionally buffing a spot that didn't meet his exacting standards. The Thornfield silver, some of it dating back 2 centuries, represented a significant portion of the family's wealth and was maintained with corresponding care. "William," Mr. Barrow addressed the first footman, "you will serve from the left tonight, and James from the right. Remember that Dr. Lancaster is to be served immediately after the master, and Mrs. Lancaster after the mistress." The footmen nodded their understanding. The order of service at a formal dinner was precisely choreographed, with guests served according to their rank and gender. In a household like Thornfield, even the placement of dishes on the table followed strict protocols that silently communicated the status of each person present. As the clock approached 6, afternoon tea concluded, and the family and guests dispersed to prepare for dinner. The transition from day to evening represented one of the most significant shifts in the Victorian household's rhythm, particularly for the upper classes. Day clothes would be changed for evening attire, a process that might take an hour or more with the assistance of valets and ladies' maids. For the Thornfield women, Eleanor and Margaret, this would involve complete disrobing and redressing, with fresh undergarments, an evening corset tightened more severely than the day version, and elaborate hairstyling. Even young Margaret, though not yet out in society, would dress formally for dinner when guests were present, wearing a simpler version of adult evening dress, appropriate to her age. The men's transformation was somewhat less involved, but still required precision and adherence to strict standards. William and Dr. Lancaster would don white tie and tails, the most formal evening wear, while James, not yet considered fully adult, would wear a slightly less formal dinner jacket. As the family retired to dress, the public rooms of Thornfield fell temporarily quiet, though they would not remain so for long. In the dining room, the final preparations were underway. The massive mahogany table gleamed with polish, set with fine Irish linen, the family's best Coalport china, crystal glasses for water, red wine, white wine, and dessert wine, and silver flatware positioned with mathematical precision. The centerpiece, a large silver Apergny filled with late-season fruits and flowers from the conservatory, dominated the table without impeding conversation across it. Silver candelabra were positioned to provide both illumination and flattering light for the diners, supplementing the chandelier above. In the drawing room, lamps were lit as the natural light faded, their glass shades casting a warm glow over the rich furnishings. Fires were built up in both the drawing room and dining room fireplaces, ensuring that the evening chill would not intrude on the comfort of the family and their guests. Throughout Thornfield Manor, from the attic servants' quarters to the grand public rooms, the household moved inexorably toward the evening's main event, the formal dinner that would showcase not only Mrs. Simmons's culinary skills, but the family's taste, wealth, and social position. In Victorian society, perhaps no single event more perfectly encapsulated the complex interplay of class, gender, and economic power than the ritual of the evening meal. As 7 o'clock approached, the transformation of Thornfield's inhabitants from their daytime to evening personas was well underway. In the master's dressing room, Mr. Green assisted William Thornfield into his evening attire with the careful precision of a ritual long practiced. First came the evening shirt of fine white linen, with a starched front that gleamed like porcelain. The detachable collar, also heavily starched, was fastened with studs of mother-of-pearl. The white Marcella waistcoat followed, cut low to display the expanse of shirt front, then the black tailcoat with its silk facings. Black trousers with a satin stripe down the outer seam, and patent leather shoes completed the ensemble, with the final touch being a white bow tie that Mr. Green tied with practiced perfection. "Your watch and chain, sir," the valet murmured, presenting the gold pocket watch that had belonged to William's father and grandfather before him. This was secured to a gold chain that stretched across the waistcoat with a small gold fob, a family seal, hanging from it. Across the hallway, Eleanor's transformation was more elaborate still. Miss Phillips had already helped her mistress into fresh undergarments, a fine linen chemise and drawers trimmed with Valenciennes lace, silk stockings held up by embroidered garters, and a special evening corset that reduced her waist even more severely than her day corset, creating the exaggerated hourglass figure demanded by current fashion. Next came the bustle, larger and more pronounced than its daytime counterpart, followed by a petticoat of silk taffeta that would create the proper rustle when Eleanor moved. Finally, the evening gown itself, a masterpiece of burgundy velvet, with a low, square neckline edged in Brussels lace, elbow-length sleeves similarly trimmed, and a train skirt that would sweep the floor behind her as she walked. The gown fastened up the back with dozens of tiny hooks and eyes that Miss Phillips secured with nimble fingers. "The pearl and diamond necklace now, madam?" she inquired, opening the jewelry box that contained Eleanor's most valuable pieces. "Yes, and the matching earrings and bracelet," Eleanor confirmed, sitting at her dressing table while Phillips fastened the precious ornaments around her neck and wrists. The final touch was her hair, which had been arranged earlier in an elaborate style of curls and twists, now adorned with a small spray of diamonds. Down the hall, Margaret was undergoing a similar if somewhat simplified transformation. At 14, her evening dress was less elaborate than her mother's, a pale blue silk with a higher neckline and fuller sleeves, in a style that struck the proper balance between childish simplicity and adult formality. Her hair was arranged in loose curls down her back, with a blue ribbon woven through them. James, meanwhile, submitted to Robert's assistance with the resignation of a young man who considered such finery unnecessary but inevitable. His dinner jacket, though less formal than his father's tailcoat, was still a far cry from the comfortable tweeds he preferred for his rambles in the countryside. At 7:30, the family began to assemble in the drawing room. William arrived first, standing with his back to the fire, the pose of the master in his domain. Eleanor joined him moments later, the rustle of her silk petticoat announcing her arrival before she appeared in the doorway. They exchanged formal compliments on each other's appearance, the closest they would come to public displays of affection. "You look very handsome tonight, my dear," Eleanor murmured, allowing William to take her hand briefly. "And you are as elegant as always," he replied, his eyes warming with genuine appreciation. Though their marriage had been arranged for social and financial compatibility rather than romance, years of shared life had bred a deep affection between them, expressed in these small, private moments. James and Margaret entered together, both moving with the careful posture that had been instilled in them since childhood. At precisely 7:15, the drawing-room door opened once more, and Mr. Barrow announced, "Dr. and Mrs. Lancaster." The guests entered, transformed by their evening attire. Dr. Lancaster wore impeccable evening dress identical to William's, while Mrs. Lancaster was resplendent in a gown of deep purple satin trimmed with black velvet, her throat and wrists adorned with amethysts set in gold. Her hair, arranged by her lady's maid Stevens, was crowned with a small tiara of matching stones, jewelry that would have been considered ostentatious in a country house during the day, but was entirely appropriate for evening wear. Conversation before dinner was deliberately light, touching on the weather, the journey, and the beauty of the Thornfield estate in autumn. Precisely at 8 o'clock, Mr. Barrow reappeared at the door to announce, "Dinner is served, madam," addressing Eleanor as the hostess. William immediately offered his arm to Mrs. Lancaster, as protocol dictated that the host escort the female guest of honor, while Dr. Lancaster offered his arm to Eleanor. James, in the absence of another female guest, escorted his sister. This carefully choreographed procession moved from the drawing room to the dining room, where the table gleamed with crystal, silver, and the soft glow of candles. Mr. Barrow and the footman stood at attention as the party entered, with the butler indicating the correct seating positions with small, discreet gestures. William took his place at the head of the table, with Mrs. Lancaster to his right and Margaret to his left. Eleanor sat at the foot, with Dr. Lancaster to her right and James to her left. This arrangement ensured that conversation could flow properly, with the guests of honor given pride of place. As the diners took their seats, the footman moved silently to unfold napkins and place them on laps, then to pour water into the appropriate glasses. Wine would be served with each course, carefully selected to complement the food. A dry sherry with the soup, white wine with the fish, claret with the meat courses, and a sweet dessert wine with the final course. The dinner service began immediately, with the first footman presenting the soup tureen to Eleanor, who served each guest in turn. Those service à la Russe, where dishes were served sequentially by the servants rather than placed on the table, had become fashionable. Certain dishes were still presented to the hostess first as a symbolic reminder of her role as the provider of hospitality. "This consommé is excellent," Dr. Lancaster commented after his first spoonful. "A hint of tarragon, if I'm not mistaken." "Indeed," Eleanor smiled, pleased that he had noticed this subtle touch. Our cook is particularly skilled with game-based stocks. The estate provided pheasant and hare for this one. Conversation during the soup course remained general, touching on the London season just past, mutual acquaintances, and cultural events of note. Politics was carefully avoided, as were any topics that might provoke strong emotions or disagreement. As the soup plates were silently removed, the fish course appeared. Poached salmon with hollandaise sauce, accompanied by small, delicately prepared potatoes. The white wine was poured, a German Riesling that William had selected from his cellar specifically for this meal. I understand from your last letter that you're researching new treatments for consumption, William said to Dr. Lancaster, introducing a topic that would allow the doctor to shine as the honored guest. Yes, indeed, Dr. Lancaster replied, warming to his subject. The connection between fresh air and recovery rates is particularly promising. I've had remarkable success with patients who spend time in elevated locations, Switzerland for instance. The conversation continued in this vein through the entrees. The sweetbreads and puff pastry and vol au vent of chicken, each served on warmed plates of coal-port china, accompanied by vegetables prepared with such care that each retained its proper color and texture. The claret was poured, a Bordeaux from a particularly good year, allowed to breathe for precisely the right amount of time before serving. Throughout the meal, the servants moved with silent efficiency. The footmen, in their livery of dark blue, with silver buttons bearing the Thornfield crest, served from the left and removed plates from the right, never allowing a diner to sit with an empty or used plate for more than a few seconds. Mr. Barrow supervised with minute attention to detail, his eyes missing nothing, from a wine glass that needed refilling to the exact moment when the next course should be brought from the kitchen. Below stairs, the kitchen was a scene of controlled chaos as Mrs. Simmons and her staff prepared each course in precise sequence. The timing was crucial. Each dish had to reach the dining room at exactly the right temperature, neither too hot nor too cold. The game course was particularly demanding, as the woodcock needed to be perfectly roasted and carved with precision. Now, Alice, Mrs. Simmons instructed as she inspected the birds. Remember how I showed you to position them on the platter, heads facing inward, beaks crossed in the center. The presentation of food was as important as its flavor in Victorian hot cuisine. Each dish was arranged to create a visual impression of abundance and artistry, with garnishes of fresh herbs, carved vegetables, or intricate pastry decorations, enhancing the natural beauty of the ingredients. As the game course was served, the conversation shifted to local matters. The condition of tenants on the Thornfield estate, improvements to the village school that Eleanor had spearheaded, and the upcoming hunting season. These topics allowed the hosts to display their proper management of their wealth and position, while giving the guests insight into country life that they, as Londoners, might find novel and interesting. We've had a particularly successful harvest this year, William remarked, accepting a perfectly carved slice of woodcock from the footman's silver server. The new threshing machine has proven a worthwhile investment. Fascinating, Dr. Lancaster nodded. The mechanization of agriculture is proceeding at quite a pace. I understand the yield increases can be substantial. This exchange, seemingly about agricultural technology, subtly communicated important social information. That William was a progressive landowner who invested in his estate rather than merely extracting profits from it, and that Dr. Lancaster, though a city physician, was sufficiently educated in broader matters to appreciate such improvements. After the game came the sweet course, the Charlotte Russe, its delicate sponge exterior concealing a filling of vanilla-scented cream, and the chocolate souffle brought to the table with theatrical timing to prevent it from collapsing before serving. With these were offered a dessert wine, a French sauternes that complemented the sweetness perfectly. As this course concluded, Eleanor caught the eye of Mrs. Lancaster and rose slightly, the signal for the ladies to withdraw, leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars. This gender separation was an essential part of the evening ritual, allowing both sexes to engage in conversation deemed appropriate to their separate spheres. "Shall we retire to the drawing room?" Eleanor suggested, and the ladies, Eleanor, Mrs. Lancaster, and Margaret, rose as one, the gentlemen standing as they did so. They departed in a rustle of silk and velvet, leaving William, Dr. Lancaster, and James to more masculine conversation. Once the ladies had gone, Mr. Barrow reappeared with a decanter of port and a cigar box made of Spanish cedar lined with silver. These were placed before William, who served his guest and son himself, rather than allowing the butler to do so. A small but significant indicator that this was now a more intimate male gathering. "Your James has grown into a fine young man," Dr. Lancaster observed, accepting a cigar and waiting as William cut the end for him with a small silver cigar cutter. "Cambridge next year, I understand?" "That's the plan." William nodded, lighting his guest's cigar with a long match before attending to his own. "Though he seems more interested in Darwin than in business at present." This slight note of criticism was permissible in the absence of the ladies, whose presence would have required a more uniformly positive presentation of family matters. James shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, aware that any defense of his interests would be considered improper in the presence of a guest. In the drawing room, meanwhile, the ladies engaged in conversation of a different nature. With Margaret present, topics remained generally appropriate for a young girl's ears, though somewhat more personal than had been possible at the dinner table. "Your daughter is growing into a lovely young woman," Mrs. Lancaster observed to Eleanor. "Will she be presented at court in a few years?" "That is our plan," Eleanor confirmed, "though at present her education remains our primary focus. Miss Barrett, her governess, speaks highly of her progress in French and music." Margaret, seated slightly apart from the older women, as was appropriate for her age, maintained the perfect posture and attentive expression that had been instilled in her through years of training. Though not expected to participate actively in the conversation, unless directly addressed, she was expected to observe and learn from the social interaction between her mother and the guest. After approximately half an hour, the drawing room door opened to admit the gentlemen, signaling the end of the gender separation and the beginning of the evening's entertainment. As they entered, Margaret rose and moved to the piano, knowing that she would be called upon to display her accomplishments as part of the evening's ritual. "Mrs. Lancaster," Eleanor said, "Margaret has been practicing a Chopin nocturne that I think you might enjoy. Would you care to hear it?" "I would be delighted," Mrs. Lancaster replied with exactly the right degree of enthusiasm, neither too eager, which might suggest surprise that a girl of Margaret's age could play well, nor too reserved, which might indicate a lack of interest in the family's accomplishments. Margaret took her place at the piano, her back straight and her hands positioned precisely as she had been taught. The piece she had selected, Nocturne in E-flat major, Op. 9-2, was challenging enough to demonstrate genuine skill, but not so difficult as to risk embarrassing mistakes. She began to play with careful concentration, her fingers moving over the keys with the fluidity that came from hours of daily practice. The adults listened with appropriate attention, occasionally exchanging quiet remarks about the music or other matters. When Margaret concluded, They applauded with exactly the right degree of enthusiasm, warm enough to acknowledge her effort, but not so effusive as to seem exaggerated or condescending. "Beautifully played, my dear," Dr. Lancaster commented. "You have a genuine sensitivity to Chopin's phrasing." Margaret blushed slightly at this praise, curtsied as she had been taught, and returned to her seat. The evening continued with conversation that gradually became more general, touching on books recently published, performances at the London theatres, and the upcoming royal visit to the north of England. At precisely 9:30, Eleanor caught Margaret's eye and nodded slightly. Understanding this signal, Margaret rose and made her rehearsed exit. "Please excuse me, Father, I must retire now. Good night, Dr. and Mrs. Lancaster. It has been a pleasure to meet you." With a perfect curtsy, she left the drawing room, to be escorted upstairs by Mary, the housemaid assigned to assist her. Her departure marked another transition in the evening. With the youngest member of the family gone, conversation could turn to slightly more adult topics, though still within the bounds of proper drawing room discourse. As the clock approached 10, the formal dinner and evening entertainment drew to its conclusion, having fulfilled its multiple purposes. Sustenance, certainly, but more importantly, the reinforcement of social bonds, the display of wealth and taste, and the performance of class and gender roles that defined Victorian society. As Margaret departed for bed, the adults settled into more relaxed, but still formal conversation. The rigidity of the dinner table gave way to a slightly more comfortable arrangement in the drawing room, though still governed by clear rules of etiquette. William and Dr. Lancaster discussed developments in industrial technology and their implications for public health, a topic that bridged their respective fields of expertise, while Eleanor and Mrs. Lancaster engaged in a parallel conversation about charitable organizations in London that might serve as models for similar efforts in the local area. The Ladies' Benevolent Society has had remarkable success with their workhouse reform initiatives, Mrs. Lancaster explained. They've introduced educational programs for the children that go beyond mere religious instruction. "How fascinating," Eleanor replied with genuine interest. "Our local workhouse conditions are quite deplorable, I fear. Perhaps something similar could be implemented here." This conversation revealed an important aspect of upper-class Victorian women's lives that contradicted the stereotype of idle luxury. Women like Eleanor and Mrs. Lancaster were expected to engage in charitable works as part of their social role, applying their education and organizational skills to improve conditions for the less fortunate, within carefully prescribed boundaries that didn't challenge the fundamental social order. Below stairs, the household continued its work, though with a shift in focus from food preparation to cleanup and preparation for the following day. In the kitchen, Mrs. Simmons supervised the washing of the numerous copper pots, specialized cooking implements, and serving dishes that had been used for dinner. This task fell primarily to Jenny, the scullery maid, whose hands were red and raw from constant immersion in hot water and harsh soap. "Mind you don't chip that platter," Mrs. Simmons warned as Jenny carefully washed the large porcelain dish that had held the woodcock. "It's part of the best service and irreplaceable." The kitchen gradually cooled as the range was banked for the night, though it would not be allowed to go out completely. The fire would be maintained at a lower temperature to provide hot water for the morning and to be ready for breakfast preparation, which would begin again before dawn. In the butler's pantry, adjacent to the dining room, Mr. Barrow and the footman were engaged in the meticulous care of the silver and crystal that had been used at dinner. Each piece of silver was washed in hot, soapy water, dried immediately with soft cloths to prevent water spots, and polished before being returned to the felt-lined drawers of the massive mahogany sideboard where it was stored. "Remember, William," Mr. Barrow instructed the first footman, "the fish forks go in this drawer, not with the regular forks. And count the teaspoons carefully. We seem to be missing one from last week." The crystal received equally careful attention, being washed in water with a small amount of vinegar to create extra sparkle, then dried with linen cloths that left no lint or streaks. Each glass was held up to the light and inspected before being returned to the glass cupboard, arranged by type and size in precise rows. This fastidious care of household objects reflected not only their monetary value but also their symbolic importance. The quality and condition of a family's tableware and serving pieces were visible indicators of their status and standards, scrutinized by guests who would notice even the slightest tarnish or chip. Upstairs, in her bedroom, Margaret was being prepared for bed by Mary, the housemaid who served as her lady's maid until she was old enough to warrant a personal servant. The elaborate hairdo was dismantled, each pin carefully removed and stored in a small silver box on the dressing table. Her blue silk dress was unfastened and carefully hung in the wardrobe, to be brushed and inspected for any spots or damage the following day. "Would you like hot chocolate before bed, Miss Margaret?" Mary inquired as she helped the girl into her nightgown, a long garment of fine white cotton, trimmed with lace at the collar and cuffs. "Yes, please, Mary," Margaret nodded, sitting at her dressing table, as the maid began to brush out her long hair with the prescribed 100 strokes that were believed to keep it healthy and shining. In the nursery, young George had been asleep for hours, having been put to bed immediately after his supper at 6 o'clock. Nurse Evans sat in a rocking chair beside his bed, mending one of his shirts by the light of an oil lamp turned low. At 50, her eyes were not what they once were, and the fine stitching required for proper mending was becoming increasingly difficult. Still, she took pride in keeping her charge's clothing in perfect condition, a reflection of her own standards as much as the family's expectations. In his small bedroom off the nursery, George slept soundly, his face peaceful in the dim light that filtered through the partially open door. On the chair beside his bed lay his clothes for the morning, already laid out by Nurse. A clean sailor suit, freshly polished shoes, and the small gold cufflinks he would wear for his birthday celebration. Back in the drawing room, the conversation continued for another hour, gradually winding down as the clock approached 10. This was considered a reasonable hour for retirement in a country house, particularly when the hosts and guests had experienced a full day of travel and social engagement. "I fear I must ask you to excuse me," Eleanor said finally, rising from her chair. "Tomorrow will be a busy day with George's birthday celebrations." "Of course, my dear Mrs. Thornfield," Mrs. Lancaster replied, also standing. "I confess the journey has left me rather fatigued as well." The gentleman rose as the ladies prepared to depart, with Dr. Lancaster offering the prescribed compliments on the evening's hospitality. "A magnificent dinner, Thornfield. Mrs. Simmons is a treasure." "Indeed she is," William agreed. "We've been fortunate to keep her these 12 years. Good cooks are increasingly difficult to find and retain, even with competitive wages." This brief exchange about servants was considered acceptable between gentlemen, particularly when it concerned the acknowledgement of a household's strengths. More detailed discussion of domestic staff, their personal characteristics, backgrounds, or specific wages would have been considered vulgar and inappropriate. As the guests prepared to retire, the invisible machinery of the household engaged once more. Mr. Barrow had already dispatched a footman to inform the guests' personal servants that they would soon be required, while housemaids discreetly appeared to light the way upstairs with candles, gas lighting not having yet been installed in the bedroom corridors of Thornfield Manor. "Would you care for hot water for washing, Dr. Lancaster?" William inquired as they ascended the grand staircase. "Or perhaps a nightcap of brandy sent up to your room?" "Hot water would be most welcome," Dr. Lancaster replied. "But I believe I'll forgo the brandy tonight. Tomorrow promises to be a full day." The parties separated at the top of the stairs, each moving toward their respective bedrooms where their personal servants awaited them. The ritual of undressing mirrored that of dressing, though in reverse order, and with the added components of washing and preparation for sleep. In the master's dressing room, Mr. Green helped William out of his evening clothes with the same care with which he had helped him into them. The shirt studs and cufflinks were removed and placed in a leather case, the white tie carefully untied and set aside for laundering, and the evening clothes brushed and hung up for future use. William washed his face and hands in hot water provided by a footman, then donned a nightshirt of fine linen and a dressing gown of navy silk before retiring to his bedroom. Unlike many men of his class, he did not wear a nightcap, considering it an old-fashioned habit. In her dressing room, Eleanor underwent a more elaborate preparation for bed. Miss Phillips unfastened the countless hooks of her evening gown, carefully removing it and the underlying petticoat to be brushed and stored. The corset was unlaced, allowing Eleanor to take her first deep breath in hours, and the camise and drawers removed. Seated at her dressing table in her dressing gown, Eleanor began her nighttime beauty regimen, a series of rituals designed to preserve her complexion and maintain her appearance. First, she removed her makeup using cold cream, a mixture of rose water, almond oil, beeswax, and spermaceti, a waxy substance derived from whales. This was applied to the face and then wiped away with a soft cloth, taking with it the rice powder and subtle rouge that she wore even in the country. Next came the application of a night cream, a similar concoction but with a higher proportion of oils designed to moisturize the skin overnight. Finally, her hair was brushed and braided for sleep to prevent tangling and breakage. "Will that be all, madam?" Miss Phillips inquired, having helped Eleanor into a nightgown similar to Margaret's, but of finer material and more elaborate trimming. "Yes, thank you, Phillips," Eleanor replied. "Please wake me at the usual time tomorrow. We must ensure that everything is perfect for George's birthday." Similar scenes played out in the guest's room, where Stevens helped Mrs. Lancaster through her own evening toilet, while Parker attended to Dr. Lancaster. The elaborate machinery of personal service, with its implicit understanding that people of certain social standing could not or should not dress or undress themselves, was a fundamental aspect of Victorian upper-class life, maintaining both practical comfort and the essential social distinctions between those who served and those who were served. By 11 o'clock, the family and guests had retired, and the public rooms of Thornfield Manor fell silent. The servants, however, continued their work for another hour or more, completing the preparation for the following day and ensuring that the household was secure for the night. Mr. Phelps and Mrs. Wilson made a final inspection of the main rooms, checking that fires were properly banked, candles extinguished, and valuables secured. Mr. Barrow verified that the silver had been properly cleaned and stored, and that the wine cellar and pantries were locked. Mrs. Simmons confirmed that breakfast preparations were in order for the morning, with bread dough set to rise overnight and the menu finalized. Thomas, the hall boy, made a final round of the house, checking that all external doors were locked and windows secured. This task, seemingly simple, was considerable in a house the size of Thornfield, with its dozens of potential entry points that needed to be verified each night. Finally, shortly before midnight, the last of the senior servants retired to their rooms, leaving only the night watch. Thomas had drawn this duty to remain awake through the small hours. Sitting in the butler's pantry with an oil lamp turned low, he would spend the night alert for any sounds that might indicate intruders, fire, or other emergencies, ready to raise the alarm if necessary. As Thornfield Manor settled into its nighttime stillness, the social and physical structure that had been so busy throughout the day remained intact, merely dormant until the cycle would begin again with the first stirrings of the kitchen maid Alice at 4 the following morning. As the grandfather clock in the main hall solemnly struck 11, Thornfield Manor completed its transition from day to night. The elaborate social performance of dinner and evening entertainment had concluded. The family and guests had retired to their respective chambers, and the majority of the servants had completed their daily duties. Yet the house was not entirely at rest. Various activities, both routine and occasional, continued through these quiet hours. In the servants' hall, the last of the below-stairs staff were finishing their own supper, a meal served only after the family's dinner had been completed and cleared away. This late hour for the servants' main meal was a practical necessity in households like Thornfield, where the staff's schedule was entirely dictated by the family's needs. "Pass the bread, if you please, Mr. Thomas," said Jenny, the scullery maid, her voice quiet in deference to the lateness of the hour. At 14, she was perpetually hungry, the physical demands of her job requiring more calories than the standard servant's fare typically provided. The remains of the family's dinner had made their way to the servants' table, though in altered form. The woodcock, having been carved for the dining room, appeared here as a rich stew, the meat supplemented with vegetables and gravy. Leftover vegetables had been combined into a savory pudding, and the remnants of the Charlotte Russ provided a sweet conclusion to the meal. Mr. Phelps presided over this late supper, maintaining the same hierarchical seating arrangement that governed all meals in the servants' hall. The conversation was subdued, focusing primarily on the next day's duties, particularly the preparations for young Master George's birthday celebrations. "Mrs. Wilson has instructed that the morning room be decorated with autumn flowers," Mr. Phelps informed the housemaids. "You'll need to check with Mr. Jennings at the greenhouse first thing to see what's available." As the supper concluded, the servants dispersed to their quarters. The female staff climbed the narrow back stairs to their rooms in the attic, while the male servants retired to their accommodations in a separate wing of the house. A physical separation that reflected the strict moral codes governing interactions between unmarried men and women in service. In the female servants' corridor, the housemaids shared rooms according to their rank, with Sarah as head housemaid having the privilege of a small room to herself. The younger maids, including Martha, occupied shared rooms with iron bedsteads, simple washstands, and wooden chests for their few possessions. The rooms were unheated, and in the autumn chill, the maids changed quickly into flannel nightgowns before climbing into beds made marginally more comfortable by the hot water bottles they had been permitted to fill in the kitchen. The male servants' quarters followed a similar pattern, with Mr. Barrow and Mr. Green occupying private rooms befitting their senior status, while the footmen and hallboys shared accommodations. Unlike the female servants, the men were allowed a small fire in their common room during the winter months, a privilege that reflected both their higher status in the household hierarchy and the practical consideration that they often returned to their quarters later, after securing the house for the night. Not all the household retired immediately, however. In the blue guest room, Mrs. Lancaster sat at the dressing table, while Stevens arranged her hair in a loose braid for sleeping. The lady's maid moved with practiced efficiency, her fingers deftly plaiting the long auburn hair that was her mistress's particular pride. "I believe the blue silk would be appropriate for tomorrow morning, Stevens," Mrs. Lancaster mused, applying hand cream to counteract the drying effects of travel. "With the lace fichu, perhaps." "Very good, madam," Stevens replied, mentally reviewing the contents of the trunks she had unpacked earlier. "And for dinner tomorrow, the green velvet or the gold brocade?" "The gold, I think. It's more festive for a birthday celebration." This quiet consultation represented an important aspect of the lady's maid's role, not merely physical assistance with dressing and personal care, but advice on appropriate attire for different occasions. A skilled lady's maid like Stevens combined the functions of personal servant, fashion consultant, and confidant. Her intimate knowledge of her employer's wardrobe and social obligations, making her indispensable to a woman of Mrs. Lancaster's position. In the nursery, Nurse Evans made one final check on young George before retiring to her own small room adjacent to his. The boy slept soundly, his face flushed with the excitement of his approaching birthday and the unusual stimulation of having visitors in the house. Nurse adjusted his blankets, pushing back the dark hair from his forehead with a gentle hand, then quietly withdrew, leaving the door ajar so that she would hear if he called out in the night. As midnight approached, the last lamps were extinguished in the family quarters, leaving only the night lights, small oil lamps with floating wicks in colored glass containers, burning dimly in corridors and on bedroom washstands. These provided just enough illumination for necessary movement during the night, while allowing for restful darkness. The grandfather clock struck 12, its deep chimes reverberating through the silent house. In the butler's pantry, Thomas shifted in his chair, fighting the drowsiness that threatened to overcome him during his night watch. At 17, he found this duty particularly challenging, the quiet hours of darkness working against his body's natural rhythms. To keep himself alert, he rose and began a slow patrol of the ground floor, his candle casting jumping shadows on the walls as he moved from room to room. The drawing room, so recently alive with conversation and music, now stood silent, the furniture shrouded in white dust covers that transformed familiar shapes into ghostly forms. The dining room, cleared of all evidence of the evening's feast, awaited its transformation for breakfast, the table already partially set with the simpler china and silver appropriate for the morning meal. Thomas's patrol took him through the main hall, past the imposing grandfather clock, and into the library, where the smell of cigar smoke still lingered faintly, despite the housemaid's efforts at ventilation. Here, the leather-bound books that lined the walls, many of them unread but essential as symbols of the family's culture and education, gleamed dully in the candlelight. As he completed his circuit and returned to the butler's pantry, Thomas noticed a thin draft from the direction of the servants' hall. Investigating, he found a window improperly latched, allowing the cool night air to infiltrate the house. He secured it firmly, making a mental note to report the oversight to Mrs. Wilson in the morning. Such attention to detail was essential in a house like Thornfield, where the comfort of the family and the conservation of expensive coal heat were primary concerns. The night deepened, the hours between 1 and 4 representing the quietest period in the household's 24-hour cycle. Yet even now, the house was not completely still. In various bedrooms, occupants stirred for different reasons. In his room, William Thornfield woke briefly, his sleep interrupted by the chronic indigestion that had troubled him for years. Rising carefully to avoid disturbing the household, he moved to his dressing table where a glass bottle of bismuth mixture, prescribed by Dr. Lancaster during a previous visit, stood ready for such occasions. He measured a dose into a small glass, diluted it with water from the carafe on his washstand, and drank it with a grimace at the chalky taste. Such digestive complaints were common among men of William's class and age, often attributed by physicians to the rich diet that signified their social position. Modern medical science might identify different causes. Stress, perhaps, or the effects of regularly consuming undercooked meat and unpasteurized dairy products. But in 1878, the connection between diet and health was only beginning to be understood in scientific terms. Down the hall, Eleanor also woke, but for a different reason. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her as she mentally reviewed the arrangements for George's birthday celebration the following day. Had she forgotten anything? Would the special cake that Mrs. Simmons had prepared be sufficient? Had the gift, a rocking horse that William had commissioned from the estate carpenter, been properly concealed until the appropriate moment? This mental checklist reflected Eleanor's role as the administrator of the household's social and emotional life. While William managed the estate's finances and business interests, Eleanor was responsible for the events, large and small, that marked the family's progress through the year. Birthdays, holidays, dinner parties, and the myriad other occasions that required planning and oversight. In the servants' quarters, sleep was similarly interrupted for various inhabitants. Jenny, the scullery maid, woke with a start from a dream of falling, her body's response to the exhaustion of 14 hours of physical labor. In the small room she shared with two other young maids, she lay awake for several minutes, listening to their steady breathing and the occasional creak of the old house as it settled in the night. Unlike some of her fellow servants, Jenny had no family nearby to visit on her half-day off each month. Orphaned at 10, she had been sent to service directly from the workhouse, her lack of connections making her both more dependent on the household for her entire well-being and more vulnerable to exploitation. Her position as scullery maid represented the lowest rung on the domestic service ladder, but it provided food, shelter, and a small wage, security that many of her workhouse companions lacked. In his private room, Mr. Barrow also lay awake, his mind occupied with the inventory of wine and spirits that he would need to conduct the following week. As butler, he was responsible for the household's considerable cellar, and any discrepancy would reflect poorly on his management. The recent disappearance of several bottles of claret concerned him, though he had his suspicions about which footman might be responsible for the theft. Such petty pilfering was a constant concern in large households, where the sheer quantity of food, drink, and supplies created opportunities for dishonest servants. The response to discovered theft varied widely, from immediate dismissal without references, effectively ending a servant's career, to quiet reprimands for minor offenses, depending on the master's temperament and the value of the stolen items. As 3 o'clock approached, the house fell into its deepest stillness. Even Thomas, fighting to stay awake on his night watch, dozed briefly in his chair, his head nodding forward before jerking upright again. The only consistent sounds were the ticking of numerous clocks, from the grandfather clock in the hall to the smaller timepieces in bedrooms and sitting rooms, and the occasional rustle of mice in the walls, constant inhabitants of even the best-maintained Victorian homes. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars visible through the gaps in autumn clouds. The formal gardens immediately surrounding Thornfield Manor lay in ordered silence, while beyond them, the estate's home farm, tenant farms, and woodlands spread across the countryside. a considerable domain that provided both income and status to the Thornfield family. Within this broader landscape, Thornfield represented a particular point in the social geography of Victorian England. Neither the grandest aristocratic seat nor a modest gentleman's residence, but a substantial country house that reflected the relatively recent elevation of the family through industrial wealth, rather than inherited land. 3 generations of successful manufacturing had provided the means for the Thornfields to establish themselves among the gentry, though the oldest families in the county might still consider them parvenus, despite their evident prosperity. As 4 o'clock approached, the very first stirrings of the new day began. In the stables, a quarter-mile from the main house, the groom rose to begin his duties, feeding the horses and preparing for the morning's activities. The animals, sensing the approach of dawn, though it was still hours away, moved restlessly in their stalls, their occasional nickering breaking the silence. In the main house, the first alarm clock, a mechanical device on Mrs. Wilson's bedside table, jangled harshly, waking the housekeeper from her brief sleep. Like many servants of her rank, Mrs. Wilson had developed the ability to wake fully and immediately, a necessity in a position that required constant alertness and problem-solving from early morning until late at night. She rose, dressed efficiently in the darkness, and made her way downstairs to begin the day's supervision. Her first task would be to ensure that Alice, the kitchen maid, was awake and preparing to light the range, the essential first step in the household's daily routine. As she descended the narrow servants' staircase, the cycle that had briefly paused during the midnight hours began once more, the great machinery of Victorian domestic life grinding into motion for another day.